The story of the British Empire is told by the sound of gunfire, a series of conflicts that pitted the world's foremost industrial and military power against the determined resistance of peoples seeking to shape their own destinies. Two such wars, separated by a generation and a continent, stand as examples of this dynamic: the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the Mahdist War in the Sudan, culminating in the siege of Khartoum in 1885 and its recapture in 1898. On the surface, they share a common theme: the violent rejection of British imperial authority. Yet, a deeper examination shows that the British military and political experiences in these conflicts were starkly different, shaped by the unique nature of the rebellions that they faced. The 1857 revolt was a deeply divided rebellion, resulting from the collapse of a system of rule by a trading company, demanding a political and military response aimed at reconquest and reordering. In contrast, the Mahdist War presented the British with an externalized, ideologically cohesive crusade, perceived by the British initially as a containable nuisance and later as a fanatical threat to be annihilated in a grand imperial spectacle. The comparison between these two struggles shows us the evolving nature of British imperialism, the adaptation of its military strategies, and the ways in which the character of anti-colonial resistance dictates the form of its oppression. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, often termed the Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Independence, was not a single event, but a catastrophic unraveling. Its origins were deeply embedded within the structure of the East India Company's rule. The British presence in India was not a classic colonial occupation of a foreign land by a distinct nation-state. It was, by the 1850s, a state within a state. The company administered vast territories, collected taxes, and commanded a massive private army, the Bengal Army, which was larger than the British regular army itself. This army, however, was a delicate fusion of British officers and Indian sepoys, bound together by a complicated web of tradition, honor, and pay. The rebellion was therefore an internal explosion within this system, a mutiny that spiraled into a widespread popular revolt. The grease cartridges for the new Enfield rifle, smeared with animal fat offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, were merely the spark. The actual fuel was decades of growing anxiety over British social reform, land revenue policies that dispossessed old elites, and an increasing cultural arrogance that disdained Indian tradition. The military experience for the British was thus one of betrayal and sudden, terrifying vulnerability. Stations like Meerut, Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow, once symbols of company power, became traps, death sentences, and epicenters of a war for imperialist survival. Politically, the British response to 1857 was one of shock, followed by a ruthless and calculated reimagination of the entire Indian project. The initial political experience was one of utter confusion and intelligence failure. The British authorities, from Governor-General Lord Canning down to district officers, failed to comprehend the depth of the discontent until it was too late. They misread the religious and cultural grievances as mere backwardness and underestimated the potent alliance forming between disaffected sepoys and dispossessed feudal rulers like the Mughal emperor in Delhi and the Nawab of Awadh. The capture of Delhi by the rebels and the declaration of the aged Mughal Bahadur Shah Zafar as emperor provided a powerful symbolic focus for the rebellion, transforming a military mutiny into a political war of restoration. The British political strategy, once they regained their footing, became one of division and ruthless punishment. They worked assiduously to ensure the loyalty of the Sikhs of Punjab and the Gurkhas of Nepal, groups who had their own grievances against the former Mughal and Maratha dominance that the rebels sought to resurrect. This political maneuvering was as crucial as military force. It prevented the rebellion from becoming a truly national uprising and turned it into a conflict that could be isolated and crushed. Militarily, the fighting was characterized by savage close-quarters combat in urban and siege environments. The British campaign was a series of grueling sieges and relief operations. The massacre of British men, women, and children at Kanpur by the Nana Sahib's forces created a powerful narrative of martyrdom and barbarism that erased British culpability and justified extreme retaliation. The relief of Lucknow's residency, after a prolonged and harrowing siege, became an epic tale of heroism. The recapture of Delhi, after a bloody assault in the city walls, was a true turning point. The British military response was not merely about defeating an enemy army, but about reclaiming lost territory and reasserting symbolic dominance. The violence was intimate and brutal. The widespread use of blowing from a gun, where rebels were tied over the mouths of cannon and obliterated, was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, designed to demonstrate absolute power and invoke divine retribution. The British military experience was one of fighting a war within their own home, a civil war within the framework of the company state, and the tactics reflected this visceral, personal nature. The aftermath of 1857 was a fundamental political transformation. The East India Company was abolished, and India was brought under the direct control of the British Crown through the Government of India Act of 1858. The policy of annexation was abandoned in favor of a new doctrine of alliance with the princely states, creating a conservative bulwark against future unrest. The Indian army was completely reorganized. The ratio of British to Indian troops was increased, and recruitment was shifted away from the Brahmin heartland of Awadh to what the British deemed martial races like the Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Punjabis. The rebellion seared into the British imperial consciousness a permanent anxiety about internal collapse and the need for racial vigilance. The political lesson was that rule required a careful balance of coercion, co-option, and a public respect for Indian tradition, all under the unchallengeable authority of the Raj. In stark contrast to the internal rebellion of 1857 in South Asia, the British faced a very different situation in East Africa in the late 19th century. The Mahdist War in the Sudan presented a completely different challenge. The British experience here was not of an internal system collapsing, but of an external, religiously driven force rising beyond their borders. British involvement in the Sudan was an offshoot of their occupation of Egypt, which itself was undertaken to secure the Suez Canal, the vital lifeline to India. The Sudan was a remote, vast, and economically burdensome territory administered for Egypt by a corrupt and ineffectual regime of Turkish and Egyptian officials known as the Turkiya. The rebellion, led by Muhammad Ahmad, who declared himself the Mahdi, the expected one in Islamic eschatology, was a reaction against this foreign oppressive rule. It was a religiously inspired national uprising, but its target was primarily the Egyptian administration. The British were, initially, a secondary player, the power behind the hated Egyptian throne. Politically, the British government under Prime Minister William Gladstone had no desire for further imperial entanglements. Their experience was one of reluctance and a desperate hope for containment. Gladstone's government was elected on a platform of peace and retrenchment. They saw the Sudan as a quagmire, a distraction from their core interest, which was the stability of Egypt itself. Therefore, the initial British political response was not to commit to a reconquest, but to extricate themselves. They sent General Charles Gordon not to wage war, but to organize an evacuation of Egyptian officials and garrisons from the Sudan. Gordon, a celebrated but maverick officer, famously disobeyed these vague orders, digging in at Khartoum and transforming the mission from one of withdrawal to one of defiance. This created an immense political crisis in London. Gordon's subsequent siege and brutal death at the hands of the Mahdists in January 1885 was a profound shock to the British public. It was a singular catastrophic event, unlike the rolling series of losses in 1857 in South Asia. Gordon's death was perceived not as a complex internal revolt, but as the murder of a national hero by a fanatical religious mob. The political experience was one of humiliation and a thirst for revenge, but it was a revenge that could be postponed. Gladstone, criticized heavily, withdrew British forces entirely, leaving the Mahdi to establish his own Islamic state. Militarily, the early stages of the conflict were defined by disaster and long-range expeditionary warfare. The British military experience was not of fighting to reclaim their own cities, but of sending ill-fated columns into a vast hostile desert. The annihilation of General William Hicks's 11,000-strong Egyptian army by the Mahdists in 1883 showed the futility of sending a conventional, poorly motivated troops against highly motivated, mobile enemies who knew the terrain. The Mahdist army was not a modern force. It was a vast host of Ansar or followers, armed with spears, swords, and outdated firearms. Their strength lay in their fanatical belief in the Mahdi's cause, their incredible mobility, and their courage in closing for melee combat. The British relief force sent to save Gordon arrived 2 days too late, a failure of logistics and timing in an unforgiving environment. For over a decade after Khartoum's liberation by Mahdist forces, the British military experience was one of a dormant front. They fortified Egypt's southern border and watched the Mahdi state, now led by the Khalifa Abdullahi after the Mahdi's death, evolve into an isolationist regime. The threat was contained, a festering sore at the empire's periphery, but not an immediate danger to its core. This changed dramatically in 1896. The political calculus that led to the reconquest was not driven by a need to avenge Gordon, even though that sentiment remained potent. What came into play now was cold imperial strategy. The rise of other European powers, especially France and Italy in Northeast Africa, threatened British supremacy. The fear was that a European power might use a Mahdist state as a proxy or establish a presence on the Upper Nile from which they could threaten Egypt's water supply. The reconquest, led by General Herbert Kitchener, was therefore a deliberate, preemptive act of imperial expansion designed to secure the Nile Valley from its source to the sea. It was a war of choice, not of necessity. Kitchener's campaign was the opposite of the chaotic, reactive fighting of 1857. It was a meticulously planned industrial operation. The British military experience this time was one of overwhelming technological and logistical superiority. Kitchener built a railway hundreds of miles through the desert to supply his army, described as a literal iron thread of imperial will. His forces were equipped with modern magazine rifles, Maxim machine guns, and artillery. The climatic battle at Omdurman on the 2nd of September 1898 was not a desperate siege but a foregone conclusion. Kitchener's army, arranged into a fortified camp by the Nile, faced the charge of tens of thousands of Mahdist warriors. The result was not a battle but a massacre. The Maxim guns and repeating rifles cut down the Ansar in waves, inflicting over 10,000 casualties for the loss of a few dozen British and Egyptian troops. It was the most lopsided victory in colonial warfare, a stark demonstration of the technological gap that had widened since 1857. In the end, the military experience was one of clinical, detached annihilation. Here, the enemy was not part of the British system, as in India. They were an external other, a fanatical horde to be mown down with industrial efficiency. The reconquest was followed by the symbolic desecration of the Mahdi's tomb and the throwing of his bones into the Nile, a final act of dominance meant to erase his spiritual legacy. The Indian Mutiny was more like a bloody civil war within the body of the company's state. It demanded a military response of desperate sieges and brutal intimate retaliation, and a political response that involved the total dismantling and re-engineering of the imperial project in India. The imperial trauma of 1857 created a Raj obsessed with control, hierarchy, and the prevention of another internal rupture. The Mahdist War, by contrast, was seen as an external plague, a barbaric and fanatical movement beyond the borders of direct British control. It was initially met with political reluctance and military disaster, then ignored for a decade, and finally eradicated in a calculated, technologically driven exhibition of imperial power, designed to secure geopolitical interests and signal British strength to European rivals. One war was fought to reclaim and rebuild a lost possession. The other was fought to eliminate a nuisance and preempt a rival. Together, they form a crucial period of imperial history, demonstrating the flexibility and brutality of British power, which tailored its immense military and political resources to crush very different forms of resistance, whether from within its own intricate systems or from the charismatic ideological challenges that arose at its edges.